We have some big topics to talk about again this week, and I'm only going to be able to touch on uh, the vast scope of some of these topics. There's a lot more depth than we are going to be able to get into, but we're going to talk about cognitive disabilities, and mostly I'm focusing on the infant aspect. So when a child with a known cognitive impairment is born, some of the ethics behind that. We're going to look a little bit at some genetic testing, what we haven't looked at already in terms of pre-symptomatic genetic testing for specific diseases. And then we're going to look at medical enhancement that'll include cognitive enhancement, genetic enhancement, etc. So lots to get to. We're going to just touch on some of these topics as we go along. So throughout this course, we've talked about how respirators and feeding tubes, etc., have kept adult patients alive and allowed to either get treatment or sometimes, the battle to remove some of that equipment to forego treatment. But that same technology has also led to the ability to save sicker and more impaired babies throughout history who would have previously died, but now they're able to live and get treatment through the neonatal intensive care units. But all of these heroic interventions at the start of life don't always create wonderful storybook results. Some of these babies that are saved live to suffer severe and chronic disabilities. And it's led to the question of whether keeping them alive was the right thing to do. But on the other hand, the disability advocates have argued that these babies could have good lives, and who's to judge, who makes the decision as to what is a quality life. So those are some of the things that have been a part of the evolution of technology and some of the repercussions or the events that have happened as a result of those technological advancements. So we have a generally good understanding of Down syndrome currently. We know that there are a lot of medical issues that are involved. We know that there's a level of cognitive impairment that's associated with Down syndrome. However, in the past, even in the 1970s, there wasn't as much information, and there was a misperception about both the quality of life that an individual with Down syndrome could live, as well as their potential in terms of their ability to function, live independently, etc. And then also really not a good understanding of all of the intestinal and the cardiac and the endocrine and the metabolic and all of the other associated medical aspects of Down syndrome. So in the early 1970s, the physicians were telling parents that the potential intelligence or the IQ of an individual born with Down syndrome to range between 25 and 60, with some children, some individuals falling below that 25 level. We know today that that's not accurate, but that was the perception at the time. So during that time, the early 70s, physicians sometimes omitted aggressive treatment for impaired newborns. One situation that is relevant, that really stands out and is reflective of a general practice that was happening at the time, occurred in 1971 at Johns Hopkins. And there were 3 babies that were born with Down syndrome in the NICU at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And they had life-threatening intestinal defects. The physicians and the parents had allowed 2 of them to die. One of the babies had a duodenal atresia, which is a blockage between the higher duodenum and the lower stomach, which prevents the passage of food and water. The mother of this baby was a nurse who had experience working with children with Down syndrome and knew that if she didn't consent to the surgery to open the atresia, her infant would die. She refused to do so. Her husband was a lawyer. The Surgeons at Johns Hopkins honored their decision and didn't go to court to force them to operate. Another mother already had children. She allowed her baby to die. She explained that her decision to forego treatment and said, quote, "It would be unfair to the other children of the household to raise them with a mongoloid." There was a perception, actually Down syndrome used to be called mongoloidism, because of the distinctive facial characteristics that an individual with Down syndrome has. So this was, a prejudicial term that shouldn't have been used, but in the 1970s, again, there wasn't a really good understanding. So this mother was described as being anguished about her decision, but when she saw that he was born with Down syndrome, she immediately said that she didn't want the child. No one killed those two babies. They were simply allowed to die. The physicians thought they were choosing the most morally acceptable path and the least likely to incur any legal prosecution. One of those babies lived for 15 days. Ordinarily, probably would have died in about 4 days, but there are notations that the nurses were secretly giving the baby water, so that baby lived a little bit longer. The third baby, the parents accepted treatment and the baby lived. The baby's parents were originally given a pessimistic prognosis by the referring obstetrician. However, the staff that were working with this family gave them a more balanced view. So it wasn't as pessimistic as it had been made out to be to the other parents and initially to these parents. In another famous case, two well-known pediatricians, R. Duff and A. Campbell at Yale New Haven Medical Center, publicly admitted, they published an article admitting that they had foregone treatment for 43 impaired infants who died early. This published admission caused a sensation and led to a lot of soul searching by neonatologists who wondered if they should follow their example. I put an article up that relates to that, the Duff and Campbell article. It's hard. I tried to access the original published article. I couldn't get the full text copy. However, this Gutman article that I published, that I put here, and it's in the Plato file, it goes into discuss a little bit about the Duff and Campbell decision. There was also, at the time, an English physician named John Lorber, and he argued that some babies suffer such extreme impairment that they're better off being allowed to die without treatment. His specialty was spina bifida, and we talked about, this will be familiar to Mairead and Lindsay, as we talked about it in the Gen Med course. But spina bifida literally means divided spine, and it's a hernial protrusion through a defect in the vertebral column. And in some cases, the part of the spinal cord can be in this protruding sac. Sometimes it's not, depending on, they have meningocele or myelomeningocele, the myelo being the most severe impairment. So it's a really serious neural tube defect, and a baby with spina bifida will almost always be paralyzed below the level of the opening, will have bowel and bladder problems, will have a variety of other issues. The opening, the herniation or the sac, makes the baby vulnerable to infections such as meningitis, and the quality of life and the ability to function and participate in meaningful activities depends on the level of the impairment and the degree of associated problems, such as hydrocephalus, which is really common in infants with spina bifida. So Lorber is famous for developing criteria to predict which babies with spina bifida, if left untreated, would die. The higher the lesion and the larger the affected area, the greater the probability of death. And so he developed this criteria, but this criteria had risks and a dilemma. If we leave it untreated, not all of the infants with spina bifida would die, And for infants who lived, non-treatment makes them worse off because you risk drying out the spinal cord, the roots, and causing a greater degree of impairment. So Lorber's criteria seem to make it possible to identify babies who would die, and all those in the lowest category of his criteria did die. So during the 70s, criteria like Lorber developed was used in several hospitals where pediatricians decided not to treat babies with spina bifida who were in the lowest category, all of whom later died, particularly one Oklahoma Children's Hospital is the one who most famously used his criteria. That brings us to the Mueller twins. So in 1981, these twins, the Mueller twins, were joined at the trunk, and they shared 3 legs, and they were born in Danville, Illinois, to Pamela and Robert Mueller. Robert, dad, was a physician and watched the babies delivered. They named the babies Jeff and Scott, and they decided that they were not going to treat the twins aggressively so they could die. Other physicians at this hospital were divided over the ethics of the Mueller's decision. An anonymous caller alerted Child Protective Services, which obtained a court order for temporary custody of Jeff and Scott. Prosecutors charged the Muellers with neglect, and later a judge dismissed that charge but also denied the family custody of the boys. In September of 1981, after pediatric surgeons testified that they would be unlikely to successfully separate the twins and that the twins had a bleak prognosis, the Muellers were given custody back again. The twins lived. They were still joined for about a year, at which time together they weighed about 30 pounds. Shortly after that, there was a long operation and surgeons were able to separate them. Scott, who was the weaker twin, died at the age of 3, but Jeff, the stronger twin, survived and later went to a typical school. So, that begs the question of the necessity of separating the conjoined twins in the first place. Is the desire for normalcy and having one child, does that create an ethical issue with the loss of the other one? And would it have been better to keep them both alive?